Thank you. Welcome to our event, Guantanamo Bay, Perpetual Purgatory or Perfect Punishment. We're going to keep the introduction short to give our speakers the total hour. Each speaker is going to have 15 minutes, followed by a 5-minute rebuttal and a 3-minute re-rebuttal. And then we're going to open up the floor to Q&As. I'm sure a lot of us will have questions. So for Mr. Murdock, he is a New York political commentator. Mr. Murdock is Fox News contributor and a contributing editor with National Review Online. He has lectured or debated at the Cato Institute, the Council of Foreign Relations, Harvard Medical School, the Heritage Foundation, the National Academy of Sciences, Dartmouth, Stanford, Tulane universities, and various fora from Bogota to Buenos Aires to Budapest.
And then we have Mr. Killmer, who is a founding member and partner at the Denver law firm of Killmer, Lane & Newman, which emphasizes its work on civil rights, employment discrimination litigation, and criminal defense. Among other positions and awards, Mr. Killmer was an adjunct professor of law here at the University of Denver Stern College of Law. He is on the board of directors of the National Employment Lawyers Association of Colorado and was named Denver Civil Rights Law Lawyer of the Year in 2016. Killmer, Lane & Newman has represented 5 Guantanamo detainees from Yemen, 4 of whom have been released and 1 of whom is still detained in the prison. We are grateful to have Mr. Killmer participate with us here today, and we will be starting our debate with Mr. Murdock.
Just one final thing. If people can sign in on a sign-in sheet when they get some pizza, it all helps all our groups get funded for next year. So, thank you.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Great spirit. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here at the University of Denver. Excuse me. Thank you very much to Jonathan Michelli and the other organizers at the Federalist Society, ACLU, American Constitution Society, and the National Lawyers Guild. Appreciate all of your involvement in putting this together. I want to say hello to my friends William Perry Penley and Liz Penley are over there. They're with the Mountain States Legal Foundation. If you're interested in natural resource law and how the federal government is involved in many issues out here in the West, it's an excellent organization to turn for information and guidance and so forth. Very happy to share the stage with Professor Killmer. Look forward to his remarks. And thanks to all of you for being here. This is a beautiful sunny day, and here you are indoors talking about a prison camp. It's rather amazing and extraordinary, so thank you for that. This is day 12 of a cold or flu, or I'm not sure what, so the last thing I should be doing is talking and debating, but here I am. So I'll do my best, so if I sound like Kermit the Frog, that's why, but we will soldier forth. So today's topic is Guantanamo, Perpetual Purgatory or Perfect Punishment. You're going to hear 2 sides of this issue, and my side of it is Guantanamo, Perfect Punishment. And I'm going to talk a bit about this particular camp, why it's there, why it should be open, and why it's a good thing in the global war on terror, and why it advances our national security as Americans and as members of the West. Now, Guantanamo Bay used to be just simply a naval base. At the end of the Spanish-American War, when the United States won, and I believe 1898, if my history is correct, we took control of Guantanamo Bay, and we've had that particular base there ever since. And until a certain event took place, it was just a place where we kept ships, and sailors would go there, Marines would go and practice, and it really had no other application other than as a military facility. And then came September 11th, 2001. We all know what happened that day in my neighborhood. I actually watched Mohammed fly over my building, and about a minute later, this happened. And then about 40 minutes or so later, this happened when a plane was flown by al-Qaeda terrorists into the Pentagon. And of course, another plane soon thereafter landed upside down, crashed in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And the question suddenly occurred, what do we do with the people we capture in this new global war on terrorism? Where do we put them? And the thought was, well, let's put them somewhere safe where they won't bother anybody. And that's Camp Delta and Camp X-Ray at Guantanamo Bay. And I'm sure you've heard stories about the overcrowding there, the horrible conditions, and so on. As you can see, pictures like this, these folks standing up in cages, tremendous overcrowding, appalling conditions. Oh, wait, these are not pictures from Guantanamo Bay. These are actually photographs from the California state prison system. Isn't that interesting? And I think you'll find in my presentation that the way that these people at Guantanamo Bay are treated in many respects is superior to the way we treat prisoners in our own country who happen to be not Al-Qaeda terrorists or members of ISIS, but American citizens. And that puts a lot of this into tremendous perspective. So this is Guantanamo Bay. This is mainly, as I say, still a naval base, and those two little squares you see on the right side, Camp Delta and Camp X-ray, are the main places where the terrorist detainees are being held. And one of the things you find is the tremendous freedom of religion that they are allowed, even though militant Islam is their creed. They're very much encouraged to pray towards Mecca 5 times a day if they wish. There are markings all over the place to make it very, very easy for them to point themselves towards Mecca when they pray. These markings are all over the facility. When detainees come in, or when they used to come in, nobody's really landed there in a while, but they're given standard issue prayer rugs, prayer beads, prayer oil, and other accoutrements which allow them to practice Islam. They also get copies of the Quran. Excuse me. This one happens to be held in a surgical mask so it doesn't touch the floor or otherwise become despoiled. When Americans hand these Qurans out, by the way, they wear rubber gloves, the idea being that no infidel should touch the Holy Quran, and therefore they wear rubber gloves when they do so. This, to me, I think is a level of deference that goes too far in that it confirms the notion that infidels are superior, which we are not. But that is still nonetheless the practice that is we engage in at Guantanamo Bay. Among regular detainees, you see facilities like this, basic cuts like you'd see in a, better than what you'd see in a California prison from pictures I showed you before. But basic cuts like you might find in a dormitory or some Boy Scout camp or something like this. And for those who are more cooperative and some of the more senior members who are kept there, they get these private cells, where any of us would want to live. But compared to what we saw in those other pictures, this is a state of relative comfort and privacy. You can see it on the other side. They're given activities such as board games, chess, checkers, backgammon, playing cards, this sort of thing to while away the hours, as well as a library of books, library of videos, and all sorts of other things to keep them distracted and not focused on violence. Exercise facilities, they've got a gymnasium there where they can work out, stay in shape, stay nice and buff. Medical facilities, which for many of them come from very primitive backgrounds. Many of them get their first medical exams, their first dental exams, first dental treatments at Guantanamo Bay. And some of the American soldiers who served down there, and sailors and other members of the armed forces, have commented on the quality of the medical care that the detainees get at Guantanamo Bay and how it's in many cases superior to what many of them have seen back home. What kind of people do we find there? We find folks such as Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of the September 11th attacks. Here he is with Bill Mark, that's a sketch. Like I say, he was the basically top military leader of Al-Qaeda and was responsible for a number of attacks that led up to the September 11th massacre. And a lot of people say, well, we got to close Gitmo because it encourages the terrorists and it eggs them on and leads them to conduct violence. It's amazing the number of attacks that took place before Guantanamo Bay detention camp opened. It was just a military base when all the following attacks took place. So it could not have been an impetus for the terrorist attacks because it was not being used for that purpose at the time the following attacks took place. Such as the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. You can see this poor woman being escorted away from the bombing by 2 members of the police, NYPD. This is the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia. Almost simultaneous attacks, I believe, in 1998 on U.S. embassies in Tanzania and in Kenya. The attack on the warship USS Cole, and of course the attack on the World Trade Center and the attack on the Pentagon. All of these took place before Guantanamo Bay opened, so it's impossible that Guantanamo Bay could have been the impetus for any of these attacks. Excuse me. Many people killed. You see the murders and wounded in these particular attacks, with a grand total of about 3,200 people murdered and 11,000 and change wounded by the people Khalid Sheikh Mohammed inspired and supervised and managed. It's also been a revolving door. There have been 714 detainees freed, according to the Office of the National Director of Intelligence. This most recent report that came out in January of last year, I think, is the latest set of statistics we have on this. And of those people who were released, 17% are confirmed to have gone back to jihad. They didn't go back and return to their homes and go into commercial real estate or farming or whatever. These people decided it'd be a good idea to go back to jihad and start killing more people like us. Of those, 31 are deceased, 22 are in foreign custody, 68 are at large. We don't know where they are. They could be overseas, they could be walking around in Denver, who knows where they are. Another 12% are suspected of going back to jihad, and if you add that up, among those 12% suspected of going back to jihad, 3 of them are deceased, 15 are in foreign custody, and 69 of them are walking around at large. Who knows where they are? And none other than your Senator Cory Gardner said about 30% of terrorists at Guantanamo Bay went back into battle. We know that a dozen or so killed Americans. And according to PolitiFact, which does a lot of fact-checking of news statements, this was regarded as mostly true. It was awful about a number. It wasn't 30%, it was 29%. And among those people released, 117 people have been killed by them that we know of, and 229 of the people have been injured. And again, these are people we know of, people who've been caught. There may have been others who've done bad things but have not been arrested or otherwise observed. And you could have people raising money, doing radical sermons, recording things that people hear that cause them to be radicalized, conducting intelligence, fundraising, any number of different things, rather in addition to blowing up bombs and that sort of thing. One of the things these people did was people who got out of Guantanamo was to become the leaders of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. One of them is Saeed al-Shahiri, who's now dead, and another is Abu al-Harith Mohammed al-Awfi, who's the man on the far right, and they led Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And they trained a man by the name of Farouk Abdulmutallab. He went on to an interesting mission, which is to fly in a plane, I think it was a Delta jet if I remember correctly, over the city of Detroit on Christmas Day 2009. And his plan was to blow up the plane and scatter bits and pieces of a Delta jet all over Detroit on Christmas Day. He had a bomb in his pants. Luckily, somebody saw him toying around with this thing, took a glass of water, poured it down his pants, and put the bomb out. Otherwise, that would have ended very tragically. And that's the bomb that was defused. That led to the New York Post to run this wonderful headline the next day. Great balls of fire. And I also wonder if we, in World War II, had been fortunate enough to capture Hermann Goering or Joseph Goebbels or Heinrich Himmler, if we would have just said, hey, well, sit back in a cell, that's okay, we won't ask you any questions. Interrogation is a very important part of this question. And at places like Guantanamo, they ask questions of these people to figure out what their plans are and what they plan to do next and how they might want to kill us. And this is a medieval torture device that they use to get information out of these people. This picture was taken by Jacob Laxon, a friend of mine who visited Guantanamo a few years back. And this is a nice, cozy sofa. It does have a little ankle bracelet where they tie them up so they don't run away. And they ask them questions here. Now, this does not exactly look like the Spanish Inquisition to me. We do have the question of waterboarding, which is tied in very much in with this issue. And among the people who've been waterboarded, the CIA says not hundreds, not dozens, not scores, just 3 people. One of them is Abu Zubaydah, who was the chief operating officer of Al-Qaeda, very much central to the September 11th attacks. He started talking, and he ratted out the names of a number of his colleagues: Omar al-Farouk, who was a notorious terrorist; Rahim al-Nashiri, who was the man who masterminded the USS Cole bombing. He also blew up a ship called the Limburg, which is a Belgian, I believe Belgian or French oil tanker. This killed a Bulgarian soldier on board. The explosion led to the spill of 11,000 gallons of crude oil into the Mediterranean. Not a good day for the environment. Ramzi bin al-Shib, also identified by Abu Zubaydah. He was essentially the 20th hijacker. He tried to get into the United States and be part of the September 11th attack, but we happened not to let him in. By the time they captured him in Pakistan, he was busy trying to arrange a plan to crash planes into Heathrow Airport. We luckily stopped that. 4 people already been hired for the job. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the most notorious criminal terrorist of all, basically the man who was two notches under Osama bin Laden in Al-Qaeda. He was captured in Pakistan. I'm starting to look a bit like this other guy here. Amazing resemblance. Tremendous. One of the things when we waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed that he talked about, which was very helpful, was revealing a plan to fly airplanes into the Library Tower in downtown LA, which is what it was called. It's now called the U.S. Bank Building. It's the highest skyscraper in Los Angeles and maybe on the West Coast. And the plan was for 4 people to get into planes, smack into this building, and basically have 9/11 West. That was the plan. And this building would have been turned into a giant barbecue with Americans roasting and jumping out of windows that we saw on September 11th. Thankfully, we waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. We got the information. We arrested the people. We're going to do that atrocity there, and that did not take place. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded, and he gave us the name of Hambali. Hambali is the man behind the Bali bombing, which killed 202 people, including 7 Americans. He was on the run until Khalid Sheikh Mohammed ratted him out and went and got him, and he's now locked up, not hurting anybody. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded, and he ratted out Ayman Faris, who was in my town of New York City. He was busy getting acetylene torches, and the plan was to go up to the cables on the Brooklyn Bridge, dress up as maintenance workers, and then cut the cables so the Brooklyn Bridge would fall into the East River. Fortunately, we caught him before that happened. And Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded, and he ratted out the name of Yassi Sufat. According to the September 11th Commission report, Sufat would spend several months attempting to cultivate anthrax for Al-Qaeda in a laboratory he helped set up near the Kandahar airport. So if he were free, he would probably be dropping anthrax around to make us all sick. Thankfully, that didn't happen. And Jose Padilla also was captured. His plan was to rent an apartment in a high-rise, close the doors, seal them with masking tape, turn on all the gas oven and burners, fill it with natural gas, then light a match and blow himself up and set the entire building on fire. We caught him before that happened, thank God. So again, Abu Zubaydah, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and Nashiri, the 3 people we waterboarded, we got lots of information out of them. I'm always fascinated by people who say how waterboarding is terrible and awful and immoral and how dare we, and yet they're perfectly fine with drone attacks where we find a terrorist there, we drone the hell out of his village, we kill him, his wife, his kids, and his neighbors, and that's okay, but if we get somebody's nose damaged to get some information out of him, that is something similar to the medieval times. I don't understand the thinking behind that. I'm almost out of time, so very quickly. Some people say let's bring these guys over to the United States and have trials in U.S. courthouses. I think it's a terrible idea. Terrorists will receive the same due process rights as the American citizens whom they want to kill. I think that's absurd and evil. The evidentiary standards that you would expect to see in a courtroom where you've got bullet casings, fingerprints, the kind of stuff that a forensic team from the police will find, very hard to get that level of evidentiary quality and a chain of custody in order to get the kind of convictions you want in court if you're taking people off of battlefields where you're not made for that sort of thing. And also people could expose state secrets in open court, thus aiding America's enemies. So that leaves us with Guantanamo Bay, right here, where we've got these bad guys surrounded by USGIs, finished, and these people can be tried and dealt with. I think they should remain exactly there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deroy. That was illuminating. I don't know if you've been to Guantanamo Bay.
I was invited to go, and just at the last minute, the whole mission fell apart, unfortunately.
Well, I wasn't invited, but I've gone about 15 or 18 times anyway. Our firm decided to represent 5 men that were captured in the so-called War on Terror. They're not calling Sheikh Mohammed or Ramzi bin al-Sheikh. These are innocent men that were captured in about 2002, February, and they were brought to secret CIA camps in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, where they were tortured. Now these are not terrorists. These are innocent men. They didn't know anything, and they were tortured relentlessly for years. And they eventually started making confessions to about anything that the interrogators wanted to hear, so that the torture would relent. And the torture sometimes would relent, and they were taught at that point to cooperate. And to cooperate would mean to agree with the interrogator that, for example, they were a bodyguard for Osama bin Laden or that they were involved in planning for things like 9/11, all of which was, I think the law calls abject bullshit. And they did it in order to relent from the torture. This is exactly what, for example, Republican Senator John McCain did when he was a prisoner of war in Vietnam and he was captured. He spent 5 years at what some people call the Hanoi Hotel. And at the Hanoi Hotel, he was subjected to brutal, unimaginable, inhumane torture from the North Vietnamese. At some point, as Senator McCain later would recall, he relented. He says every man has his limits, and he started to make confessions to things he hadn't done. He started to make anti-American statements for propaganda purposes, and this is just what happens when you are tortured. Now, Deroy has been given information that this is something like a country club when you go to Guantanamo Bay, and he showed what he called a cozy little couch. Well, that is completely deceptive. That's not what happened here. They might have had couches that had blue velvet that would be padded. That wasn't for everybody, by the way. Sometimes it's a carrot and a stick thing. They would give cooperative people a little bit better treatment, and they would give non-cooperative people worse treatment. But the idea that there was no torture at Guantanamo Bay and at the secret CIA black sites for months and months and years beforehand has been thoroughly debunked. If Deroy's suggestion here is that treatment has always been good, it's false. That's just not true. Now, I wanted to give some, I get upset at this because I've talked to some of the men who have undergone this treatment. And I've read an awful lot of stuff, both classified and not classified, about this. And almost all of the examples that he gave, for example, who Khalid, Sheikh Mohammed snitched on, Jose Padilla, he gave Jose Padilla, Sufat, Faris, Hambali, who did the Bali bombings. He says under waterboarding, KSM snitched on all of these guys. But what he fails to mention is that in 2014, a Senate Select Committee on Intelligence debunked all of that. I have it right here in my hand. For example, on ferries, the Senate Select Intelligence Committee in 2014, which is after he wrote his articles about 3 cheers for Guantanamo, said a review of CIA operational cables and other records found that the CIA's detention and interrogation program and the CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques, that's torture, played no role in the identification and capture of Imam Faris. The same is true with Hambali. At page 305 of the Senate Select report, which was classified for many years but was recently unclassified, it says a review of CIA operational cables and other records found that information obtained from KSM during and after the use of CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques played no role in the capture of Hambali. The same is true with Jose Padilla, who was allegedly going to set off a dirty bomb. KSM's information gave no role. Also left out from Mr. Murdock's presentation was that KSM recanted all of this information. He was being waterboarded and tortured otherwise, and he said, yeah, okay, Hambali, he did the Bali explosion, so, back off. So they would, and they would reward him at that point. But later he recanted all of that. That has all been confirmed in a 6,700-page study by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Now, when we decided to take these cases, we did so in 2006 because we're human rights lawyers, we're civil rights lawyers. We were essentially challenged by friends within our community that you have to take these cases, and we did so. Completely naive as to what we were getting into, of course. We said, sure, we'll represent a couple of these people. There's some really good lawyers on the East Coast working on these, and we'll coattail along with them. What we assumed, so wrongly, was that we could coattail along with them. We thought it was going to be a single issue case, and it would go to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would strike down this apparatus that had been set up under President Bush, where people were being held what President Bush thought was outside of the jurisdictional grip of the United States, and therefore would be outside of any, fundamental niceties such as due process or protection from torture under the Geneva Accords and things like that. What we found out over the course of years was every time one of the detainees would make it to the United States Supreme Court, the Supreme Court struck down that apparatus. It says, no, in fact, you're not outside of the jurisdictional grasp of the United States. In fact, these detainees have the right to habeas corpus. Congress tried to change the law and say, well, we're going to pass a law now that says they're outside of habeas corpus. It went to the Supreme Court again, and they said, the Constitution is what gives you the right to habeas corpus. So Congress's effort to deprive detainees of that is unconstitutional. They also said that it's within the reach of the Geneva Accords. So torture is illegal. So that's when we had to do some, we being the United States, I'm ashamed to say, we had to do some fancy footwork to say, well, this isn't torture. That's where we came up with these nice little euphemisms like enhanced interrogation techniques. Enhanced interrogation techniques, it sounds like you're just raising your voice a little bit, or you're scolding them with a good finger wagging. But that's not what happened. The enhanced interrogation techniques weren't just waterboarding. That also is sort of a red herring. Waterboarding did only happen to a few people, but the enhanced interrogation techniques included massive sleep deprivation on hundreds of detainees. Now, Deroy gave a couple of statistics. There have been 779 men who have been detained at one time or another in Guantanamo Bay since this was set up. 779. Almost all of those were under President Bush. Not many people realize, but President Bush himself released 537 of those people. So although it started with 779, 537 were released by Bush and about 200 were released by Obama. 41 people remain in the camp. And if you wonder, is this a good place to be compared, for example, to the U.S. court system? That would be the alternative, right? If people blow up the World Trade Center, that's terrorism, yes, but it's a crime too. And you can convict them of crimes. If they commit crimes, they go to criminal trials. And the U.S. court system is awesome at convicting terrorists of crimes. That would be the alternative. Well, you got to think that the military commission system that we set up at Guantanamo Bay must be better if you've got intelligent people like Deroy Murdock saying that's where we should send more people and we should try them down there. If you thought that, you would be wrong. It's a clusterfuck of a system. It's completely unprecedented in our law, and therefore it's been very slow and subject to a lot of challenges. Courts have affirmed the right to challenge the proceedings down there, and challenged they have been. How successful has this been to have a judicial system down in Guantanamo Bay? Well, out of 779 people who were captured, I mentioned that number, there have been 3 convictions. 3. We just started the 16th year of this place, and there have been 3 convictions. One guy down there, a guy named Galani, Deroy brought up the idea that there were some bombings in Tanzania and Kenya. That's true. Those East African bombings were suspected to be participated in by a guy named Galani. He went to Guantanamo Bay. Was he convicted there? No, he wasn't convicted there. But he was transferred to the Southern District of New York, and the Southern District of New York made pretty short work of him, although they gave him due process. He had a lawyer, he had the right to call witnesses, he had the right to get evidence, just like you would get, as you've all been learning in law school, in our due process system. And he went down the tubes. He got convicted, and he's now in prison. Now, this is, I would say, a Guantanamo failure. Fortunately, the Southern District of New York convicted him. There are only 7 active prosecutions down there. So out of 779, only 7 are active. There's only 41 guys down there. So these active ones are sort of the all-stars that Deroy was talking about. Khalid, Sheikh, Mohammed, Ramzi bin al-Shib, Abu Zubaydah. Those guys, they're not my clients. My own guess is they're probably pretty bad hombres. But that's 7, right? There are 41 people down there, 7 of which have been cleared for release. This is something that the public doesn't know much about. But a system was set up in the early years of Obama to say, all right, we need to get our 6 agencies that know what they're talking about, allegedly, together, and we need to review each file individually. Department of Defense, the CIA, Department of State. There's 6 agencies that have some interest in finding out, is this a bad hombre or can he be released? That's been the system that most of these hundreds of people have been released. These 6 agencies have to determine unanimously between all of them that this fella can be released either back to his home country, or if it's Yemen, probably somewhere else, because Yemen's pretty unstable. That's where all of our clients are from. Well, hundreds have been released under this sort of thoughtful, evaluative system, and some of them haven't. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed will never be released. He's being charged. But there's 34 other guys there who haven't been charged. Can you imagine? 16 years in prison, and they haven't charged you with nothing. You can't say I'm innocent because you're waiting to hear what you're guilty of. They don't even have hearings set. They're just sitting there. It's indefinite, perpetual purgatory. And that is why it's unconstitutional. We've recently filed a new petition for habeas corpus on behalf of on behalf of our client, and there's 10 other clients that are in this petition. We filed it on January 11th this year. That's the 16th anniversary of the opening of the prison. And it stands for the proposition that enough is enough. I mean, even if in the fog of war after 9/11, when we're all legitimately terrified as to what's going on, you might be able to capture people on the battlefield, although most of these guys weren't captured on the battlefield. They were just captured in cities and towns and so forth. Many of whom, by the way, were captured in exchange for the receipt of bounty money. If you would turn somebody in as a terrorist, then they'd give you $5,000, and your neighbor, who's always been a pain in your butt, might get captured by the Pakistani secret police and turned over to the United States. But they're sitting there, including our one client who remains, Suhail Shaheen, who has not been charged with anything. The intelligence on him, I've reviewed him in a secure facility in Washington, D.C. All of the evidence is classified, so we have to go out there if we're going to work on the case. And, it's just a bunch of hocus pocus. Hundreds of these guys who have been in Guantanamo have been accused of being Osama bin Laden's bodyguards or involved one way or the other in these cases. But there has never been any proof. And if there was proof, don't you think the government would marshal it? Don't you think they would come up and say, of course Suhail Shaheen is a terrorist. Here's the evidence of it. They'd give it to a court, and they would convict him, charge him first, and then convict him of a crime. They have refused to do that with Suhail and the other 34 people who are sitting there without charges. I run into the same problem Deroy did. We run out of time. We've got a lot to say. You can see if you get me going. I mean, especially if you get a beer in front of me, look out. I mean, I'll talk about this as long as you want. But the idea that these are really nice proceedings and nice interrogations is what really burned me. And some of the torture techniques that have been confirmed to be used, and that I know for a fact were used, unless the wool has been pulled completely over my eyes, include sleep deprivation, hooding, shackling, nudity, beatings. They'll shackle these guys, and they'll shackle them to the ceiling in stress positions for days and days, and they'll douse them with ice cold water. They'll bring in vicious dogs, and a lot of cultures, Muslim cultures, have a fear of dogs, and they'll bring in dogs. Sometimes they'll put on dog collars, and they'll lead them around. They're treating them just like animals. One of my clients had electrodes stuck to his scrotum, and they said that if you don't tell us that you were in fact part of Al-Qaeda, then we're going to shock you with this. And Musab, who was 20 years old and the only thing he really knows is how to play volleyball and soccer, he's just a kid, said, of course I'm a member of Al-Qaeda. Yes, I'm a member of Al-Qaeda. They said, good thing you finally confessed to that, and they took these electrodes off of his scrotum. And then they used that confession to say, this is why he's being detained at Guantanamo Bay. What would you have done? There's an awful lot of other stuff, but I think I've probably run out of time. Thanks for your patience.
I've got 5 minutes before my voice completely fails me. I see, by the way, back there, my old friend Willie Matthews, a wonderful artist here who paints, does watercolors and other works in the American West. I normally see him with a hat on, so I didn't recognize him until just a moment ago. So, well, there he goes. That's the Willie Matthews. Thank you very much. I appreciate very much Mr. Keller's passion. I know that we've already said, but I appreciate the passion with which you deliver. You're an excellent advocate. I think one of the voices of the people who've done interrogation, who've defended waterboarding and these other practices, is a veteran CIA agent, John Kuryakin, who was interviewed on ABC News. And John Kuryakin was a 14-year veteran of the CIA. And he was involved in the capture and interrogation of Abu Zubaydah, one of the 3 men I mentioned who was waterboarding. And he said he was the biggest fish we had caught. We knew he was full of information and we wanted to get it. And they were trying to figure out how to get this information out of him. They sat down and talked to him, they asked him questions politely, and they got nothing. He basically recited words from the Quran. He'd speak in Pashtun, his Arabic, his local language, and so on, and not be at all cooperative. Eventually they received high-level permission to waterboard him. According to Kuryakin, he said, quote, "It was like flipping a switch," unquote. A short time afterwards, in the next day or so, Kuryakin informed ABC's Ryan Ross. He told his interrogator that Allah had visited him in his cell during the night and told him to cooperate because his cooperation would make it easier on the other brothers who'd been captured. And from that day on, he answered every question just like I'm sitting here speaking to you. And that seemed to make the difference. He didn't want to go through that experience again, and he decided that he would be cooperative and answer questions. Kuryakin added the threat information that he provided disrupted a number of attacks, maybe dozens of attacks. So this actually turned out to be extremely valuable and useful information. Kuryakin, the interrogator, also said this: "What happens if we don't waterboard a person and we don't get that nugget of information? I would have trouble forgiving myself." One American official at a waterboarding discussion recalls a number of Republican and Democratic leaders in Congress who were asked about, were informed about waterboarding and the other interrogation techniques. And despite the fact that many of them have turned on this and say this is a terrible thing, he said at the time the concept was not, "Oh my God, this is crazy, what are you doing?" He said there was no objecting, no hand-wringing. On the contrary, according to the Washington Post, Joe Warwick, the briefer was specifically asked if the methods were tough enough. Among those in the room at the time, Dianne Feinstein and Nancy Pelosi. And early on, they wanted to waterboard these guys and do whatever it took to get the information out of them. And then as the war on terror went on, they turned on that and decided that was no longer their policy. We heard mention of John McCain contending that waterboarding is unreliable since detainees will say anything to make it stop. And they may say anything to make it stop. One thing they might do is tell the truth. Nobody ever focused on the notion if you're being waterboarded or going through one of these other unpleasant experiences. You know, you could make something up, or you might actually tell the people, okay, here's where the bombs are, here's the name of my trainer, the training camp is located in XYZ location. If you want the pain and the torture to stop, one way to make that stop is to tell the truth. And I think that we've gotten a lot of truth out of these people. McCain also argues that he's argued that America must reject waterboarding lest our enemies waterboard USGIs. Unfortunately, we've seen USGIs get beheaded, which makes waterboarding particularly difficult. I've never heard from the people who object to waterboarding and these other techniques as to what we should do. All right, you don't like waterboarding, you don't like putting hoods over people's heads, you don't like barking dogs, what have you. But I never hear from them, all right, well, let's do these things instead. You know, this would be a much more effective or humane way to get this vital information out of people. We know what they're against, but I'd be very curious to hear what techniques they think are effective that will get us this vital information we need so people don't have additional opportunities to kill us and our loved ones. We heard mention from my colleague across the way there about the number of people who have been cleared for release. Many of these detainees have been cleared for release, but it's very difficult to get anybody to take them. A lot of countries are not interested in taking these people. They don't want to go back to they don't want to take people back from their home countries. In some cases, we've had to pay countries like, I believe, Uruguay to take some of these people and give them a nice payoff to accept these folks and essentially, you know, put them into their custody rather than ours. And finally, as I mentioned before, 17% recidivism rate of people that we know are confirmed to have gone back to jihad. Some of these people might have gotten caught on the net who shouldn't have been, but there are also a lot of people who were caught in the net, deservedly so. And it's very sad and unfortunate that we let them go because we did. And they went back and they returned to jihad. And there are people now living in cemeteries, in caskets, with a lot of people crying over their graves on their birthdays because we made this stupid mistake of letting them out of Guantanamo rather than keeping them right there where they're not bothering anybody. Thank you. Well, here I go again. We should do this over pictures, don't you think?
I agree with that. Well, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed confessed to being responsible for the 1993 and the 2011 World Trade Center attacks, also to planning the Library Tower attack, the Sears Tower attack, the Plaza Bank attack, the Empire State Building attack, which all those never happened, taking out a port of Singapore. He was going to bomb and destroy the Panama Canal, too, he told the interrogators under enhanced interrogation techniques. He was the guy who was trying to assassinate President Jimmy Carter. I hadn't heard of that either, because it's just BS. He told them everything. I've got an entire list of 17 or 18 things that he confessed to that was just abjectly ridiculous. He recanted most of them later, but this is exactly how unreliable it is. And reliability is a keystone of intelligence gathering, and all intelligence gatherers know about that. Now, Deroy wonders, well, if we can't waterboard them, how can we get information? Well, waterboarding is illegal, so we've always historically gotten information legal ways, which you do in intelligence gathering communities like the FBI, and even some versions of the CIA know this. You build rapport with the person that you're interrogating. You present them with other evidences you've come across, and sometimes you just can't break through. That is the price that sometimes we have to pay of living in a democratic society with human rights as values. That is the price we sometimes pay living under the restrictions of the Geneva Accords. That's the price we pay once we enter into international agreements with other countries that say we're not going to torture their prisoners of war and they can't torture our prisoners of war. You've heard politicians blather on and on about how these other countries, President Bush said, Saddam Hussein, they torture people. If that's not the definition of evil, I don't know what is. This was, of course, before it had gotten out that that's what was going on under his watch as well. Now, Deroy says that KSM collapsed quite easily. He said it's like flipping a switch. That was his source on that was, I think he read somewhere, a CIA interrogator, Kuryakin, said that. This is exactly what the Senate Select Committee, with Kuryakin's, the emails that were involved with Kuryakin and other CIA agents back and forth, were saying, you know, this is what has been debunked by the report that I was carrying around a little bit ago. It's just not true. You know, I don't know if any of you noticed when you got recidivism statistics from Deroy in his first presentation, it said 17% of people returned to jihad, and then about 3 slides later it said 29% of the people returned to jihad. Now that is the whole, that sort of shows part of the problem. What is it? And by the way, what does return to jihad mean? Some of these groups that are trying to calculate and quantify the number of people who've gotten out and how bad that they are, they call it return to jihad, but what does that mean? Well, the definition of some of those is so broad as to even include anti-American statements. So if you got out of Guantanamo Bay after being there, say, for example, for 10 years, and being tortured, for example, having probes in your scrotum, and you then leave and you make an anti-American statement, that would have been counted statistically as a recidivist or a return to jihad under those studies. And that's kind of ridiculous. So, the last thing I want to talk about is due process. You know, it is frustrating sometimes to give due process. It would be a lot easier to imprison people if we didn't give them the right to counsel, for example, or if we didn't give them the ability to see the charges against them. Some countries do that, and their legal systems are efficient as hell. They get people into prison real easily, and there's almost no fight against it. But we've decided that our values include due process. We fooled most of the world that we live by those. By the way, my own clients said that when they were captured, for example, by the secret police in Pakistan and eventually turned over to the United States, their first thought when they were turned over to people at the CIA was, good, now the torture's going to stop. Now we're going to be into a system and this will all be made sense of. That was their first thought. Soon to be dashed because the torture increased and continued. If we're going to have these values, if we're going to brag about them, if we're going to have the gemstone of a legal system, which we're proud of, which is universally, when it's run correctly, when it's universally run right, is respected and admired and sought, then we have to live by them ourselves. We can't just ignore that when the going gets tough. That's what we're fighting for. That's why we are the good guys and they're the bad guys. If we do exactly what we've accused them of doing, then what is it we're protecting?
Thank you. We just heard about the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention, of course, is an agreement among nations, among states. Al-Qaeda is not a state. ISIS claimed to be a state. They're now down to about 1 or 2% of their former territory. They also happen not to be signatories to the Geneva Convention. So to whatever extent we adhere to it vis-a-vis these people are adhering to an agreement with which they have not agreed. So be aware of that. Regarding the 17% versus 29%, 17% refers to the number of terrorists who are confirmed to have returned to jihad. 12% is the number suspected to have returned to jihad. So that adds up to 29. I focused on the 17% were confirmed, which is the much scarier number. I'm sure of the 12% suspected, some proportion of that actually did go back to jihad, but we know 17% have been confirmed to have gone back to jihad. I'll give you just one example. A man by the name of Ruslan Odiev, I think is how you pronounce it. He and 6 others left Guantanamo. They were of Russian descent, were Russian citizens. They went back to Russia, and the Russians kept them for a while, and they released them and let them go. And Odiev and his mates subsequently helped assault a town in the Caucasus called Nalchik on October 13, 2005. They killed 49 people, and they wounded 115. So this is what happens when we let the bad guys go. They leave here, where they're not bothering anybody. They go back to Russia. They get set free. Okay, have a good life. Bye. And off they go, and you end up with 49 people in the cemetery and 115 people walking around with arms or legs or eyes or ears or who knows what else missing. And they carry those physical and no doubt psychological scars for the rest of their lives. We've talked a lot about waterboarding, but some of the techniques that we're not allowed to use are pretty benign ones, I think. If any of you happen to go to a bar, perhaps with Mr. Keller tonight, and tied on 1 or 2 too many and got in some trouble, and the cops took you down to the jailhouse, they sometimes will engage in what they call the good cop, bad cop routine. One cop will come in and be rough and nasty and terrible and try to ask you, so where were you guys drinking? What kind of beer did you have? And then a nice cop will come in and say, that guy's hot-headed. Let's just, let's do it the easy way. Talk to me and I'll get him off your back. That's called the good cop, bad cop routine. We're not allowed to do that with these guys. That's too much. It's the same good cop, bad cop routine that we use in American police departments all around this country every day without any objection from anybody. I don't think even the ACLU is opposed to the good cop, bad cop routine. That's considered too much and a human rights violation and excessive at Guantanamo and with these other people who are accused of or guilty of and very much involved in some of the most heinous and vicious and bloodthirsty crimes you can imagine. So again, as I've stated before, this is perfect punishment, and these people are right there in the middle of the Caribbean, and we're much safer with them there on that island, not walking around among us. Thank you.
If there's any authority whatsoever to support that last statement, that good cop, bad cop form of interrogation is somehow prohibited at Guantanamo Bay, I've never seen it and I'd like to see it. That's not a human rights violation. It's standard interrogation technique. I've never even heard that until Mr. Murdock said it today. It's just not true. That is one way they can interrogate. Secondly, he says Al-Qaeda's not signed on to the convention and neither has ISIS. Well, that's true. But what we've done is we've signed on, and the people that we're capturing are citizens from other countries, Yemeni or Moroccan or Saudi or whatever, and they are citizens of those countries. So it's not like they lose the protections to be protected by human rights laws just because they've been captured by us and we label them a terrorist. They are still citizens of signatories to those agreements. And if we didn't want to abide by them, we shouldn't have signed them. I heard on the radio over today, I was on NPR, it was just coming over, and you'll see it in the paper tomorrow, I think. Somebody in our State Department Trump State Department, I think, has declared victory over ISIS, all right? It's over. We beat them. We beat ISIS. And really, you can find a lot of articles in the last several years where we also beat Al-Qaeda. We beat them. Okay, well, you know, you may want to debate that or not, but these are the official government proclamations. And I can tell you an interesting legal nicety that the entire legal basis for Guantanamo Bay is embedded in something called the Authorization for Use of Military Force. This is a statute that was passed by Congress that authorizes the president to do these sorts of things, very broadly interpreted, if we're in a battle against Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. Those were the two enemies after 2001 bombings. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban were who we were after. At some point, we announced that we beat Al-Qaeda. The Taliban is certainly not a problem with us anymore, and ISIS wasn't even in the authorization for the use of military force. So that brief that I told you we filed on January 11th of this year is based upon the idea that the authorization for use of military force, the entire legal basis for the operation of the Guantanamo apparatus, has expired, and a lot of other arguments as well. So, you know, this idea that Al-Qaeda, they've been decimated completely. I mean, Osama bin Laden's dead. Their second, third, fourth, and fifth, and sixth, and seventh commanders have all been either killed or captured. I don't know if you guys were paying enough close attention a few years ago. I was because of this. But, you know, we kept killing the number 3 guy in Al-Qaeda. It happened like 5 times in a row. We've killed the number 3 guys. There was a different guy.
Hard to kill, evidently.
It was kind of weird. Now, it's mathematically possible, because once you kill 3, then 4 moves up to 3, and you knock him off 2. But it was just kind of part of the propaganda war for this. But then we announced it's all over. And if it's all over, so should Guantanamo Bay.
Now I guess we'll take questions and answer them until we're told to stop. Let me, as they say in Congress, revise and extend my remarks. I misspoke a little bit. The good cop, bad cop routine so common in U.S. police departments could be used, but not without the express approval of the Secretary of Defense. So it's not permitted, but you have to get the Secretary of Defense's specific approval to do the good cop, bad cop routine.
And he has approved it. I mean, you don't have to on each interrogation. It is an approved method of interrogation, so they can do it. They're probably doing it right now. They still do interrogate these guys. It's laughable. They said, oh, I had another interrogation. I said, it's 2018. They said, I know. Would they ask you the same stuff? You know, what do they know now that they didn't know in 2005, for example?
How much time do we have?
We have like 5-10 minutes. The event officially closes at 1. But we have the room till 1:15. So as long as the speakers are kind of willing to stay.
I'll give it 10 minutes. I got to stop talking. I'm dying here.
And then I'll just keep talking.
And you can let me until 5 o'clock probably.
My voice is getting stronger.
It's getting stronger. Yes. And I live at sea level. I'm a mile high up here.
Sure.
Yeah, so
You guys will choose.
So do you think it's a strategic mistake for us to say abide by the Geneva Conventions while our enemy doesn't? And if we do capture our enemy, we treat them in a way where that treatment won't be reciprocated if one of our troops is captured?
Deroy, you want to?
I would say, generally speaking, we don't want the Geneva Convention or any other agreement to be a suicide pact. Whatever we do as a country every day should be things the best we can of which we're proud. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that people are busy murdering us and murdering our loved ones, murdering our allies, that we don't take the steps we need to get the information to keep them from doing that again.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and that's vital. And I think if we tie our hands behind our backs to the degree that these people continue to put us in danger and kill us, we're not talking about doing some graffiti or some just robbing purses. I mean, these people are busy murdering people. And every now and then you turn on the TV, and even though attacks in the West have tapered off, thankfully, lately, you still see folks walk around and just, what was this, a week ago, they blew up a hotel in Afghanistan and killed, I think it was several dozen people, I forget the number, but I think it was 40, 50, something like this. So this continues. This war, unfortunately, hasn't ended, and we need to take the steps we can to neutralize these people.
No, it's not a mistake. If we didn't want to abide by these human rights agreements, we shouldn't have entered into them. And there is no evidence that our torture somehow it makes us safer from the recent terrorist attack that Deroy is referring to. No evidence whatsoever. I mean, there's an underlying racist sentiment here, and I'm not suggesting you're at all racist, but the racism that if we torture an Arab Muslim in Guantanamo Bay, then somehow people in India are going to be safer from attacks is completely misguided. And President Trump, I think, is the major sponsor and public statements on Twitter, and he even used the Geneva, we can't let the Geneva Accords be a suicide pact too. That's a phrase that he might have even tweeted it probably. But it's
I heard it before he said it.
okay, or maybe he heard it from you.
Maybe
yeah, that may be. He retweeted Deroy. That might be. But I think there's no empirical evidence whatsoever that there's a relationship between that. In fact, it's the other way around. There's a growing consensus that this type of treatment at our hands is a terrorist recruiting tool. This is what causes people to say, America is a terrible place. Look how they are treating people. They enter these agreements and they violate them. It actually increases the terrorist attitude against us. There's excellent evidence of that.
And as I pointed out, when I watched Mohammed fly over my building on September 11th, saw an American Airlines jet go over my building, and about a minute later smack into Tower 1 at the World Trade Center. Guantanamo Bay didn't exist. Waterboarding wasn't going on. So these people had a very, very deep hatred of us well before any of these techniques were being used. Another question, please. Why don't you stand and tell us who you are? Over here. Why don't you stand up and tell us who you are?
My name is Ryan. I'm a now.
All right, now.
I just want to know what your response is to the over 70 suicide attempts from Guantanamo prisoners over the past 15 years. And it's a pretty staggering number. Almost 10% of people there have tried to commit suicide instead of endure torture.
Correct. What is my response to suicide attempts? I've heard that some of the folks who are there have been told when you get there, be a troublemaker. And one of the ways of making trouble is suicide. And particularly when you have people who are jihadists who engage in suicide attacks, suicide bombings, this sort of thing, it's not surprising that they would seek that option or take that route. So I think if they stay alive and can be put on trial, et cetera, and meet justice that way, great. And if that's what they choose to do, again, that's not something that's terribly surprising given the line of work that they chose.
Put on trial, they wish to be put on trial. I mean, they've been begging to be put on trial. That's what they want. And I mean, if it makes sense to y'all that them killing themselves, they think is some sort of method of being a troublemaker and that it's going to hurt the administration that's doing this to them. I mean, that makes no sense to me. These are not stupid people. Most of them are not bad people at all. They're just that were swept up. But the suicides is very troubling. I think the implication of your question I agree with, this is the implication I took, which is the conditions must have been so desperate, so brutal there, that suicide was determined by those individuals to be the best way out. Death would be better than life. That definitely has happened.
Thank you, please. You get the next one, okay?
I found statistics about how few of them have been.
I'm sorry, I can't quite hear you.
Oh, sorry.
What's your name?
My name's Elvira,
Hi,
and
Elvira.
I found the statistics about how few of them have been actually tried in any capacity very compelling. If all of these are, I have no doubt that there's some bad hombres among them, but if so many of them were indeed people against whom there was evidence, compelling evidence of wrongdoing, why haven't more of them been put on trial?
What better way to legitimize this whole system is to prove how guilty they are. Look, we got the right guy. We put him on trial. It was a fair trial. And they're guilty, and now they're in ADX in Florence or something like that. I agree with you. I think but the answer is they don't have the goods to do it. And they do have some confessions, but those have been elicited by virtue of torture, and that would make it inadmissible. I mean, this is what I was talking about a couple of minutes ago, which is that how Guantanamo has actually increased the disrespect for the United States and for our system. Imagine, you're in a military prison, you're being prosecuted by military lawyers, and your judge is a military person as well. And it's all in secret, and you're not allowed to see the evidence. So if they ever do come up with a conviction, most people say, yeah, right, of course. But they haven't even done that. There's been 3.
Elvira, to answer your question, one of the arguments, agree or disagree, is that if we put these people on trial, various state secrets will get out, classified information will get out in open court, and this will make it easier for the bad guys to know what we're up to. So that's one of the arguments that's been raised against trying them in open court. Go ahead if you want to pick the next person. I think we'll do one more, guys. I can't talk anymore. Croaking here.
Class starts at 1:15 as well.
Okay.
One, you made the assertion towards the end that this has something to do with race, and I would just like to point out that white converts to Islam pose a much larger threat in counterterrorism circles than Arabs, so I don't think that that's the case. Second of all, you said something about somebody being picked up by the secret police in Pakistan and thinking that the torture was going to end in the hands of the CIA and that not happening. I find the idea that torture was worse under the CIA than under Pakistani secret police to be laughable, and
Based on what? I mean, what's your information?
well, with all due respect, what is your information that the CIA torture is worse than Pakistani secret police? Somebody who was picked up as Pakistani secret police and then allegedly tortured by the CIA? That doesn't seem
Four of our clients were in fact picked up by the Pakistani, the secret police, and they're called ISI. And they were picked up and then eventually, a week, 2-3 weeks later, turned over to CIA. CIA would then put them in a dark site and hold them there for 30, Mossad was held for 40 days there. So there's a pretty good comparison as to what happened to you by Pakistan versus what happened to you once you were in CIA.
But my question is, do you think it's really credible, the assertion that treatment was worse under the CIA than the ISI?
There's no question. There's no question it was. For one reason is it was longer. For example, Mossad was a week with the ISI and 40 days in the dark prison and then to Guantanamo. And the duration has an effect. But also the techniques used were worse. ISI, they were kind of old school, like cavemen. They would punch you and they would kick you. I mean, that hurts and it's bad. You want it to stop, but it's not.
Based on your client's testimony?
Yeah, well, not just what he's telling me. I'm reading reams and reams of classified information at the secure facility, yeah.
And you're aware that some probably very large percentage of people who are held by the ISI never make it out because they're assassinated, right?
Yeah, those aren't my clients.
Okay, so you understand that could really skew the information that you're getting, right?
No, I didn't say CIA is worse than ISI. I'm saying CIA treated my clients worse than ISI.
I find that really hard to believe. And I'm extraordinarily critical of the CIA and their behavior. But if we're going to be intellectually honest about this, the idea that a Western intelligence agency is acting more brutal than the ISI is...
What basis do you have to say that? If you're questioning his basis, where are you coming from? You're just asking this question.
Well, what I'm asking is where he's getting this. And he's getting this by somebody who's picked up...
He just told you. Tell him where you're getting anything that you're saying.
We're talking about Pakistan. We're talking about the country that held Osama bin Laden in our faces while they were an ally.
Okay.
We're talking about a country that is known to hate us, that is known to torture those people, known to disappear people. We're talking about a country that is brutal to people.
If that's all true, it should really make you worried about what our government's doing,
No,
shouldn't
I
it?
am worried.
Yeah.
And we were kind of hand in hand with them. I mean, I don't want to blow that off. I'm not saying Pakistan was nice. They
And
weren't.
I don't want to give room to the CIA that they don't deserve. I'm very much opposed to a lot of what the CIA does. But I believe in perspective. The idea that the CIA is going around acting like monsters in comparison to the ISI strikes me as...
Well, at the risk of sounding like our own government, which I don't want to do on this issue, a lot of stuff I can't tell you because it's classified.
Yes.
And that's unsatisfying to the listener because that's what they say about our guys too.
Sure.
But let's call it the dead heat, okay? It's like Pakistan, even if you want to go that far.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Wonderful. I guess the moral of the story is don't get sick. Thank you very much.